Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm going to give y'all a few minutes to get situated into the room before we get started. If we were back at the chamber, I'd be asking you to finish up getting your bagels and coffee, finding your seat. The music's about ready to stop. So thank you all coming in. You have joined us for the July Nonprofit Council breakfast, and this is our second time of doing this virtually, and I could not have done this alone because Raylan Marlowe is just the goddess from National Leadership Institute and has helped put this together. She did last month. I don't think she's going to take my phone calls anymore, but this morning we're actually going to be doing something a little different than our normal setup. And again, we will not be going around and introducing everyone, but if you would like to, in the chat section, put your name and what organization you are from, we would appreciate that, being able to track it. And then without any further ado, I am in anticipation of learning lots and maybe getting a little uncomfortable in my chair, but I would like to introduce Raylan Marlowe from the National Leadership Institute. So thank you, Raylan.
Robert, thank you. And I have on record, this is being recorded. You called me a goddess?
Yes.
Thank you. Fantastic. And most of our regular nonprofit people are used to you going around with the hook and making us sit down, and so this is very different. But today is actually a very serious conversation, and I am so thrilled with our speaker. I'm so glad that she was available to join us. But I want to set up a few things first. I am Raylan Marlowe with National Leadership Institute, or NLI for short, and we focus on two things: better boards, better leaders. And what we're talking about today certainly matters to any leader, whether you have a formal or informal title. So, as our regular Fort Lauderdale Chamber guests know, when NLI is part of the program, which is typically once a quarter, it means we've worked really hard to bring together a panel of experts on an educational topic that enhances the daily work of our nonprofit audience and our corporate supporters. Today's format is intentionally different. After discussion with Robert and Tracy, which is always fascinating and a great conversation, we made an intentional decision to have one speaker and one voice. And the decision was to give this topic, it's a very complex, emotional, racially charged, confusing, thought-provoking topic. We wanted to give it time to breathe. So we also wanted time for you to ask your questions. We wanted interactive. And Chevara is very good at that. In fact, I think we're going to start out interactively, if that is a proper way to say it. So our topic is the move to racial equity, and Chevara will explain that. For some, this may feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. There is zero intent to shame or point fingers. That's really important to me to say as someone who worked on setting this up. I've left some events where I felt shamed, and I came to learn. Today is about learning. So any look back is historical perspective. The goal is to move forward in a better way. So let's get started. We're going to cover history, a little bit of the psychological and physiological side of racism. We'll explore where non-Black leaders and allies may be unknowingly complicit in racial inequity. You may be doing things you don't even know about, and that's what part of today is about. And most importantly, tools and resources to help us all strive to bring about a more equitable sector. So, okay, we want your questions. The amazing Miss Chevara Orrin, she is a national public speaker. She is an award-winning diversity, equity, and inclusion strategist. She is a social entrepreneur. She's a published author, a filmmaker, a public speaker, a social justice activist. She does not sleep. And if you've ever had a conversation with Chevara, at the end of it, you just walk away going, man, I need to do more, or at least I do. That's every conversation I've left with her. She is currently working with Fortune 500 companies like Facebook, United Health, Kaiser Permanente, with St. Jude's Children's Hospital. So many people are calling her on a national stage to do this work. So we are grateful that she's here. Chevara, the floor is yours, and let's get started. And this will be Q&A. We will have questions throughout, but please start us off.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to say thank you so much, Mike, Robert, and Raylan, for inviting me to be a part of the nonprofit business breakfast. And I am deeply appreciative for all of you who are here. I can't see you, so I feel a little disadvantaged. So I really do appreciate those of you who are putting your names and your affiliations into the chat box. That just gives me a better sense of the sector of the community that's here this morning. Before we move forward, and I go into the dialogue that I'm going to have with Raylan, I'd like you in the chat box to put one word that describes how you're feeling right now in the midst of our socio-political climate of racial unrest. One word. I will give you a little grace and let you have a compound word, but no more than that. One word, please. Angry. Tracy, thank you for that. Hopeful. Ernest, thank you for that. Alexa, cautious. Discrimination. David, thank you for that. Matt, hopeful. Thank you. Rick, frustrated. Fern, frightened. Linda, frustrated. Lucy, processing. Thank you for that. Jan, momentum. Robin, angry. Kwesha, enraged. Kathy, frustrated. Deidre, called. Thank you for that. I feel called too, Deidre. Thank you. Jenny, frustrated. Angela, opportunity. Yes. Denise, sad. Gayleen, frustrated. Adriana, disappointed. Monica, sad. Carla, irate. Thank you for that. Simone, curious. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, what it means to be intellectually curious. Thank you so much for that. Hopeful. Thank you, Brenda. Lori, powerful. Thank you for that. I will ask one other thing. If you're like me, my name is Chevara, and often in my lifetime, I've encountered people who are unpracticed or unfamiliar with the pronunciation of my name. So if you often encounter people who are unpracticed and unfamiliar with the pronunciation of your name, I invite you to spell your name phonetically in the renaming on the your little box, just so that when I say it, to the best of my ability, I am pronouncing it correctly. And if you would put your required pronouns next to your name too, just to help us get a better sense of who's in the room. And I just modeled something when I think about leadership and inclusion. Anyone notice what I said right before pronoun? What did I say? What word did I use? Did anyone catch that? Started with an R. Required, what do we normally hear? We hear preferred. Preferred somehow gives the illusion that you have option, right? But if I am telling you this is how I identify, then it's what? It's what's required for me. And it's what's required for you. So I just want to, as we're sharing today, think about how as leaders, we can model the behavior that we want to be seen throughout our organizations, and also model, right, how we're going to be treating each other. So thank you. Thank you so much for that.
And Chevara, I just wanted to jump in and say, there are a couple things I did not mention in your intro. And Mike, the fabulous Mike from the Fort Lauderdale Chamber, I do hope you'll send out Chevara's entire bio, because it is so powerful. You know, you've done a lot of work not only in the racial equity space, diversity and inclusion, but also with the LGBTQ space. So you've been recognized, in fact, by the White House and as a human rights campaign for your work. So what you're doing is getting national attention. You're making a difference on so many platforms. And I think what we wanted to do here to start is give a little historical perspective. When we talked, what you helped me understand is that the history, the past from 400 years ago, it still matters now. There's still a connection that I didn't connect until you explained it so eloquently, and you explained why it's important now. Will you please share that with everyone?
Sure. So before I go into our nation's history, I'd like to give a little context setting about me. I see some of you in the space I do know, excited to see several of my colleagues and friends from Leadership Broward last year. I've got to give a shout out to my class, so thank you for being here. I'd like to share that on the slide prior to this, I'm going to just go back for a second. You see, I am daughter descendant of both immigrant and enslaved. I also want to context set for the scarf that I'm wearing, for those who might be unfamiliar and might take offense that I'm wearing a scarf that says colored only, no whites allowed. So that's actually a sign from the Deep South, from a venue where Black people were relegated to. So remember, we had segregation, we had Jim Crow. So in the Deep South, there were spaces where Black people weren't able to go. And so on some of the venues, you would see colored only, no whites allowed. It did not mean that white people were being discriminated against. It simply meant that was the only place that Black people were allowed. That's actually a freedom scarf, a collaborative between a local artist, Phoenix, who's here in Fort Lauderdale. That's our freedom collection that honors the freedom riders of the 1960s. And the image at the bottom is my father from 1961. He was a freedom rider on one of the first buses in Mississippi. And the image next to him is my mother. I'll talk about them in just a moment. So I wanted to set that context. As daughter descendant of both immigrant and enslaved, I am the great-granddaughter of Samuel Rutsky, who first set sail on the St. Paul from Kiev, Russia, and landed in our nation in the state of New York in 1902. I am also the great-granddaughter of Burrell Bevel, born on a cotton plantation into enslavement and bondage in 1837. The image you're looking at now is my great-grandfather, Samuel Rutsky. The baby on my great-grandmother's knee is my grandfather, my mother's father. And here's an image of my grandfather to the far left. He's wearing a hat. He is the son of my great-grandfather. And the young man with the cotton, the burlap sack over his shoulder is my father. This image is actually from a Pulitzer Prize winning book. When I think about the context of history of this nation, we arrived one of three ways, right? We are either descendants of indigenous people, we are descendants of immigrants, or we are descendants of enslaved. That's it. That's how we arrived. My mom, Suzanne, this story is not complete without my parents. My mom, Suzanne, that's at the very top. She's holding me in Cuba when I was about 5 months old. She's an extraordinary white Jewish civil rights, human rights, anti-war, and anti-apartheid activist. When she was 23 years old, she was the lead organizer of the 100,000 person march on the Pentagon in opposition of the Vietnam War. Below my mom is my father, James Bevel. He was one of the inner circle with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. My father was responsible for many of the major strategies of the 1960s civil rights movement. He was the architect of the 1963 Birmingham Children's Crusade, the open housing work in Chicago that ultimately led to the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And we've had lots of discussion this week in our nation as realty companies decide that they're no longer going to be using the language of master bedroom or owner suite. So there's a deep connection there. My father was also the first to call for the march from Selma to Montgomery. In the chat, did anyone see the movie Selma by chance? Yes, no? Came out about 3 years ago. Ava DuVernay, thank you, Robert. Yes, yes. There's an actor in that film. His name is Common. He's a Grammy and Academy Award-winning actor. He portrays my father in that film. So I wanted to begin with my history, making the connection. I identify as a Black woman. My Black is political. My mixed raceness is biological and historical. So I did want to do a little bit of context setting. When I think about the history of our nation, for a very long time, right, we were thinking that enslaved people didn't arrive on our shores until the 1700s. And then this fabulous publication came out. I don't know if you can see it. The 1619 Project, it won a Pulitzer. Remember Nicole Hannah-Jones? And she talked about the fact that in 1619, there were 20 enslaved people who were aboard a ship that landed in the port of Virginia, here in our nation. How many of you in the chat heard the story when you were growing up that they, whomever you believe they to be, they might have been colonizers, pilgrims, explorers, they went to Africa and brought back slaves? Anyone hear that story? Yes, no, yes? They went to Africa and brought back slaves. Yeah, yeah. What if instead the narrative that you were told is they, whomever they are, went to Africa and stole nonprofit leaders and physicians and nurses and farmers and scientists and biologists and grandmothers and aunties and mommies and daddies and sisters and brothers? Is that a different narrative? Yes, no? In the chat? How does that sound different? What sounds different about it? In the chat? What sounds different? Human beings, the humanity of it all, right? Notice I use the word enslaved versus slave. So if you believe the narrative that they brought slaves back, then I as a Black person, as a Black woman, have always been a slave. If you understand that they stole human beings and enslaved them, that's who did what to whom, right? It's a little bit different. We're going to move quickly through this history. When we think about the 1700s, 1790s, we were at the height of the slave trade in this nation. 1793, something really important happened. We started to have these fugitive slave acts, and what was really important about them, it wasn't just to return the runaway enslaved people, but it also made criminal white people who were abolitionists who dared care enough about enslaved human beings to want to help them, so you could also be placed in jail, you could be put to death, further dividing. So when we think about the American oligarchy and this idea that we're going to divide people who might have an economic interest to be aligned, I just want you to hold that in the back of your mind, because I know a lot of you as nonprofit leaders are responsible for communities where there are deep disparities, right? 1852, one of those abolitionists, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? Speaking out against slavery. And in 1915, something really interesting happened. As much as we progress in this nation, we also regress. We find ourselves rolling back. 1915, W.E. Du Bois, he wrote a piece called The Negro, a seminal work that really spoke to the power and the beauty and the boldness of who Black people were. And at the same time, Birth of a Nation was produced and released. Anyone see Birth of a Nation in the chat? Anyone familiar with it? Birth of a Nation. Yes? Do you remember where it was screened? Anyone know where it was shown in our nation? Anyone? Anyone? The White House. Thank you, Ernest. Yeah, shown at the White House. It's the first time. I want you to hold on to narrative, because we're going to watch a film and a short clip in a moment about these stories. So the narrative, Birth of a Nation, was the first time we saw the narrative. We were able to envision this narrative of the Black man as unintelligent, a sexualized beast out to defile white women. And here we are in 2020, and we saw that play out in Central Park when Amy Cooper picked up her cell phone and she said, I am going to call the police and tell them what? What did she say in the chat? What did Amy Cooper say to Christian Cooper? In the chat. I'm going to tell them a Black man is attacking me, because she understood the power of that narrative, of that single story, right? 1921, we had the devastation of a community called Black Wall Street. It was just in the news a week ago. Anyone remember where that was? Anyone? Tulsa, Black banks, Black barbershops, Black houses, 35 city blocks burned down, 300 Black people massacred, 800 injured, 9,000 left homeless. There's a fabulous book by a fabulous professor at Emory. Her name is Dr. Carol Anderson. It's called White Rage. She's also a Guggenheim Fellow, and she posits that white rage is in response to Black progress. White rage is in response to Black progress. Between Reconstruction and World War II, we had 4,400 Black people lynched in this nation in the Deep South. Some of you may be familiar with the EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, down in Montgomery. The brilliant Harvard-educated attorney Brian Stevenson has created the first monument memorial to those people who were lynched in our nation. We're going to move along a little fast. We're going to go to 1960s. I told you a bit about what my father was doing. Would be remiss if I didn't mention Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, separate but equal schools, right? We know now that our schools are more segregated than they've ever been before, certainly in the time of the 1960s. And I've got to give a shout out to 1967, that's Loving versus Virginia, because before that time, my existence on this planet, in this nation, was a crime. We think about the 1980s and 90s, we had Nixon and Rockefeller, the war on drugs. I personally believe there's really no real intent to solve the problem of the war on drugs. We put too many people out of business, but that's another talk for another day. 2008, we elected our first Black president, and we said we were what? Because we had overcome, it starts with a P, it's a compound word, a hyphenated word. What did we say? In the chat, 2008, Obama was elected, and we were now proclaiming ourselves to be post-racial. Thank you for that, Ernest. Right. Here we are in 2020, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we are far from being post-racial. I'm going to play a short clip, and then we're going to come back together.
I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story.
Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay. Raylan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Chevara, thank you for that. I think that when the history and the look back sets the stage so well, because at the end of this, we want to get to what can we do now? That is our goal. And we're watching the time. We're at 9:56 and we've got a lot to get to. So I think what we want to talk about next is you define where we are right now today as the intersection of diversity and inclusion and social justice. You say it's not about equality. It's moved way beyond that. It's about equity. Let's talk about that.
Sure, sure. So, about a year or so ago, one of my colleagues in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, we started talking about this idea that we really needed to be more deeply interrogating this intersection of diversity and inclusion and social justice. And at the time, a lot of corporations were a little hesitant to even use the language of social justice. So the language of social justice, you hear words like power. Chimamanda Adichie, the brilliant writer who you just heard, she talked about power towards the end of the clip that we saw. And equity is a heavier lift. And in simple terms, when you think about yourselves as leaders, if you were to hire two people at the same time and they came into the office and you said, I'm going to give you the exact same things. I'm going to give you an office and a desk, and you're going to have a lamp, you're going to have a MacBook, you're going to have a trash receptacle. And on the first day, one of them arrives and is a wheelchair user. Now, you've given them the exact same things. You have provided equality. Equity would be giving that employee, right, that has specific different needs, what it is that they need to be successful. So thinking about equity as a heavier lift. So I just want you to think about it from that perspective. One of the ways that we're seeing this change in our space right now, a lot of corporations, when they think about partnership with nonprofit organizations, they typically will write a check. We've seen a lot of that during the past 4 weeks, 5 million here, 10 million there, a lot of the money going to the same organizations, not because they have a relationship, but because it's easy. What I've been doing is having deeper conversations with corporate executives, moving from a corporate social responsibility model to a corporate social justice model, where you're thinking more intentionally about what a long-term relationship looks like. A 3 to 5 year relationship with an organization. Are you invested in the community where that nonprofit says it spends its time and its dollars, right? So just reframing the way we think about how we're going to be doing diversity and equity in corporate spaces.
So, Chevara, I want to ask you then, writing a check, that's a very big deal. But once you write that check, when a corporation steps up and puts money, quote, where its mouth is it, if they don't know exactly where it's going or what it's funding or how it's being used to make the right kind of difference, is that as positive as it seems to be?
Well, so, one of the things that I think that organizations, nonprofit organizations, and corporations need to be thinking about is alignment. I started tracking very early on when the racial unrest happened. First, we had Ahmaud Arbery's lynching, then we had Amy Cooper with her racism in Central Park, and then we had the murder that all of us witnessed of George Floyd. And corporations immediately came out with statements. And so what I was tracking is the disalignment. So there was rhetoric that wasn't in alignment with current policies and practices. And I think for nonprofit organizations, the question when we're thinking about this from a social justice equity lens is, should you be taking the money? There may be some organizations that are not aligned. There, for example, in our own community, there are people who serve on boards in our community who have personal values and practices that are in disalignment with the nonprofit that they are serving. An example could be someone who builds prisons. Now, people can build whatever they want to build as a developer, but if you are building prisons that disproportionately impact Black and brown people, and then you serve on the board of an organization that specifically is to support Black and brown youth, might we have some hypocrisy there? And an organization, a nonprofit leader has to make the decision, am I going to take this money knowing that the very core of the work that this organization is doing is is the antithesis of what we support and believe? And that could be a very difficult question, but it's questions that I'm having with organizations like St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. I take them down to Montgomery, Alabama, and that's the very question I posed in a group setting with a case study. Like, what would you do? What would your response be? So I think that some of this responsibility also lies within the nonprofit sector. And the question is, are you willing to interrogate yourself? Right? Because the nonprofit industrial complex is something to think about. And are you willing to interrogate whether or not you have policies and practices that perhaps go against the very, the very communities that you are supporting? So those are just some questions. I'm not asking you to answer them now, but ways to think about interrogating your own complicity in a system that upholds perhaps racist policies, practices, and ideals.
And we talk a lot about in nonprofit about ethical fundraising. AFP is based, the Association of Fundraising Professionals is based on ethical fundraising. So it puts a different spin on it when you approach it from the language and the lens that you just used. So another thing, and forgive me, you may want to talk about this a little bit later, but you made such a great example of the statements. Everybody right now is putting out a statement. This is where we stand on racial equality, racial equity, social justice. And you said there were 3 types, and one company nationally is doing it right. Will you share those 3 types? Because I think that was really powerful.
Sure. So again, when the statement started coming out, a lot of the corporations started taking action, as well as nonprofits making statements. So one way that organizations were coming out was shock and distancing, right? Oh my goodness, I can't believe that this is happening. Well, we just had a brief history that shows you history is repeating itself. The distancing is, but we don't do that. We're a non-racist organization. Then you saw solidarity and empathy. And empathy is always such an admirable goal, but oftentimes we stop. We stop at empathy when we really should be moving towards compassion, because compassion is empathy plus action. So the third way that organizations were coming out was compassion and action. And when I think about that middle column, solidarity and empathy, I think about Delta, the Delta CEO, Delta Airlines. For the first time, we've never heard such strong language. He said, we will not stand for racism, bigotry, and hatred. And we're not used to, in our America, hearing that type of language from our corporate executives. I personally was waiting for Ben & Jerry's, because Ben & Jerry's always comes out. You know that phrase, go home, or what is it, go hard or go home? Ben & Jerry's always goes hard. They came out immediately. Does anyone know what Ben & Jerry's came out with in the chat box? What their statement was? Anyone in the chat box? Someone want to look it up on their phone real quick? It was very, very powerful. While you're looking that up, what I am going to say about Ben & Jerry's, when you think about commitment of organizations right now in this moment and the way that nonprofit organizations can align themselves, they have taken on the prison industrial complex. So they have an ice cream flavor called Justice Remix that specifically helps raise money to dismantle and disrupt and move towards prison reform. They came out with, we are going to dismantle white supremacy. That's what Ben & Jerry's said. That's what's on their thank you, Deidre. Silence is not an option. Dismantle white supremacy is what happened. And I say that word, and I would imagine some of you probably felt a little pinched. In the chat box, I said white supremacy, and what did you see or feel in the chat box? Thank you for that, Deirdre. Yeah. In the chat box, what did you feel? Resurgence? You see any images in your head? David, thank you. It's real. White supremacy. Truth, Robin. That's not me. Shame. Yeah. Yeah. Someone look up the definition of white supremacy and drop it in the chat box, please. A lot of times people say, I saw KKK or I saw neo-Nazis, right? Or skinheads. But part of this idea of moving towards a more equitable lens of how we have the conversations and do the work is that we have to be unafraid to name the systems. Anyone have the definition of white supremacy? They can drop in the chat. We have to be unafraid to name the systems. And that's all the systems, right? That's patriarchy. That might be, thank you, a person who believes that the white race is inherently superior to other races and that white people should have control over people of other races. It's a way of demystifying some of the language so it doesn't seem so fearful, so that we can get to the crux of it and do the real work around action to dismantle some of these systems. And thank you for that, Anne.
Chevara, I just want to kind of summarize what you said on the statements, because I think when after George Floyd and so many things happened, the protests, statements from everywhere were coming out. And if you didn't issue a statement, you almost felt wrong. You needed to know what to say. So when you broke it down 3 ways. There's the shock statement, we don't do that. There's the empathy statement, no tolerance, no hate, no bigotry. But you say the right model is empathy plus action and compassion. And that was the Ben and Jerry's model. So I think I just wanted to summarize that a little bit so people will maybe look it up after this, because that was really powerful to me to look at what we should be saying.
Thank you for that. I also want to say, I hesitate to use language like right? Because it's a continuum. It's a continuum. And so I don't want people feeling shamed or scared or frustrated if you're not where Ben and Jerry's is. Maybe that's not where you are on your journey. The goal would be, right, incrementally to move along the continuum so that ultimately what you're creating within your organization is intentional action that helps dismantle and disrupt these systems of inequity. Thank you, Raylan. Thank you so much.
And thank you for correcting me, because I used the word right. And I'm not sure what the word is. Maybe the word is progress, learning. I'm not quite sure, which is one of the reasons I wanted to be a part of this today, because I learn from you every time we talk. And one of the other things we talked about was the physiological and the psychological impact of racism on people of color. It is different. It's very different, and that sounds kind of logical, but the way you explain it is very powerful.
Sure, thank you for that. So when I think about the nonprofit sector, and I'm going to ask a question, I'd like you to respond in the chat, nonprofit leaders. When George Floyd happened, how many of you held space, sacred space for your Black employees? Yes, no, I did, I didn't. I wish I had. Yes, thank you for that, Robert. And by sacred space, I mean holding a space that was specifically for Black people to express whatever frustration, rage, pain that they might have been experiencing in that moment. How many of you were hesitant? Anyone hesitant and not quite able to do that? Worried about how to move through or navigate what you had also seen and how to perhaps be in solidarity? Thank you for that, Ernest. Signa? We've got a lot more people on the call than are responding. And this isn't a call out, this is a call in. So, what the data shows us, Columbia University and Pew Research, that on a cellular level, when Black people experience racism, very similar to PTSD. So a racist event, something racialized happens, and 3 months later, you are still reeling from that effect. I mentioned to you earlier a little bit about my historical background. My great-grandmother on that cotton plantation in Alabama, enslaved, whatever horrific beatings and subjugation she experienced, on a cellular level, my great-grandmother's DNA lives in me. So when we think about generational trauma, right? So I'm not just experiencing my own trauma as a Black woman who was once a Black girl. And I'll give you one quick example. I didn't watch George Floyd, the video, for a while. For the past few years, I've opted not to watch those videos. I personally have experienced enough racial trauma in my lifetime to last several lifetimes. And so to see it is very triggering. I felt compelled after reading a lot of think pieces, and also a lot of corporations were calling me to do this work. And I wanted to make sure that I had proper context. And what I thought about as I was watching that video, when I was a little girl, I moved to Memphis, Tennessee when I was 5, and we lived in a 4-room duplex. I grew up in abject poverty, standing in food stamp lines. And our next door neighbor, Mr. Jack, was a middle-aged white man who would sit on his porch with his double-barreled shotgun, and he'd point it at me and my little sister, and he'd call us racial epithets as we'd walk to and from school. And my sister wrote about that account when she was applying to law school, actually at Yale, and she recounted what it was like, the fear that we had. And I remember watching the George Floyd video and feeling that same sense of terror just grip me. And that happened when I was 5. That was decades ago. And so as leaders, particularly non-Black leaders, it's really important to recognize that your Black employees, and if we're taking this even broader than this moment, but I want us to be mindful that we are centering the experiences of those most deeply impacted in this moment and right now in our nation, those are Black people. But it could be a synagogue gets bombed. And are you as a leader thinking differently when your Jewish colleagues and your staff come in? And for Black people in America, unfortunately, it seems as though every week we are watching something play out right in front of us. And so are you holding space within your organizations to recognize that there are some deep-seated historical and generational traumas that are being revisited on your Black employees and with your Black staff?
I'm sorry, I was watching the chat there. There's been some great comments.
Yeah, looking at the chat now too. Yeah.
So, you know, there's a lot of things, parts and pieces in there I want to pick up on, but I think we want to talk a little bit about tools, resources, actions. What can we as nonprofit leaders, as just those in the workforce, what can we do to bring about a more equitable sector? What are our action steps, Chevara? What do we do?
Sure. Well, I actually want to go to something that Carla just put in the chat. Thank you for that, Carla. You're absolutely right. You know, one of the things that nonprofit leaders, when we look at the statistical data, we've not moved many more percentage points than the 1990s when we look at board composition. And we've got boards that are 94% of all nonprofit boards are white across this nation. And shame on us in the sector, right, for not lifting this up and doing something differently. Oftentimes, too, what we find is the leadership of these organizations are not representative of the communities that they are serving. So the first thing that I would ask nonprofit leaders to do is to do that introspection, interrogate, go back to your mission, and sit down and right that wrong. Right? So what do your hiring committees look like? What do your hiring pools look like? Are you doing an equity assessment of your pay scale? You know, one of the things that I'd like to get started, we don't have time in this conversation today, but for so long, and I spent time in the nonprofit sector. I spent 6 years working at a university. I've worked in the arts and culture sector and directly in the nonprofit sector. We have this language of, well, I do it because I'm passionate about the work and I don't do it for the money. Well, you should. This isn't free labor. And one of the things that I'm cautioning corporations against doing in their sectors right now is all of this racial unrest that's happening, and it's happening within the nonprofit sector. And so as you're grappling with what to do, the easy answer might be to ask the Black person on staff. The challenge with that is the emotional burden, the Black fatigue that's happening across the nation when you put the burden of your education on a white person. There's a fabulous group out there, 2 white women from the Midwest. It's called White Nonsense Roundup. Anyone ever heard of it? If you're on social media and you're a person of color, and let's say you're writing about something and maybe it's race related, and then so someone white hops on your page and maybe they make an inappropriate or racist comment, all you have to do is tag White Nonsense Roundup. They've got 100 white volunteers who are highly educated on issues of race and social justice. So they kind of come to the rescue. These white women said it was a way for them to gather their own people, right? like gather them up themselves. So one of the things that I would recommend is that white people educate themselves. White nonprofit leaders, non-black nonprofit leaders, educate yourself so that the burden of that education isn't on your black employees. And the resources are so, there's such a wealth of resources, whether it's Robin DiAngelo's White Privilege, whether it's Dr. Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. There's a fabulous organization that exists across the nation called SURGE, Standing Up for Racial Justice, primarily led by white people. I was even on a call recently, Rednecks for Black Lives. I was the only black person in the room, about 150 folks who are descendants of coal miners and bootleggers. And they talked about things like colonialism and imperialism. They absolutely understood the connection from the slave trade. As Michelle Alexander says in The New Jim Crow, we didn't really end the system of slavery. It simply evolved into the prison industrial complex. And at the very end of their call, after they talked about strategy, they said in the chat box, I want every single person in here to put in the name of one person from your family that you're going to have an anti-racist conversation with, because we got to talk to grandma. It was so powerful. So when I think about as nonprofit leaders, as non-black nonprofit leaders, doing the work within your own institution, educating yourselves, bringing in trained professionals to make sure that you understand the intersection of identity, dimensions of diversity. What does it look like to be socially responsible to the community that you serve? What does a disruption of your all-white board look like? Are you making connections with Black professional organizations like the National Black MBA Association, National Black Lawyer Association, National Black CPA Association? I'm calling out those three sectors because oftentimes those are the types of sectors we want on our boards, right? We want attorneys, we want CPAs, we want people from these professional sectors. So again, I believe the interrogation starts internally within the organization to really ask the question, am I complicit in upholding a system of inequity? Absolutely. Thank you for that, David. 100 Black men of Greater Fort Lauderdale. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. And you can be diverse and not be inclusive, right? Diversity and inclusion aren't the same thing. Diversity is simply the mix of people that you have in the organization. If you haven't created a culture of inclusion where your Black and brown employees, your Black and brown managers feel empowered to bring their voices to the table, their ideas to the table, then you simply have a mix of people and not the inclusive environment that you need to move the work forward.
And Chevara, I want to, okay, so I was taking notes on some of this. You said boards. I'm going to share something one of our board members at NLI said. She is a powerful white female attorney. She does a lot of work with women's rights. She said she is sick of boards that are pale, male, and stale. No offense to anyone, but I got to tell you that has resonated with me so much. But when you're looking for a diverse board and equity on your board, you mentioned exceptional candidates in the hiring process. It's not just about having a person of color on your board. It's so much more than that. The type of person, the skill set, what do they bring to the table? It is not a check the box scenario.
Right, it's not. And if you haven't created a culture of inclusion, then those board members aren't going to stay, right? Because you've brought them in really under false pretenses because perhaps you do need to check the box. I mean, you know, part of what we talked about before is this idea that in this moment, what I believe is needed is white humility in response to Black rage and resistance. And the best example I can give of that is actually my mom, Suzanne, who I mentioned to you earlier. I want to read just a sentence, 2 sentences to you. It is obvious from the actions of citizens that they intend to control their own lives and communities, even if it means burning and taking what they think should be theirs. And if the same old structures rise again, they will be burned again. Several nights ago on television, a businessman said that his store was looted. Then he put steel doors on it, and it was looted again. That shows the determination of the people to take what they consider to be rightfully theirs. Persons don't intentionally burn down that which they own or find satisfactory, only that which they can no longer tolerate. In the chat box, which city do you think that came from? We've had a lot going on in the past 4 weeks. In the chat box. Chicago, Atlanta. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Carla. Minneapolis. That was written by my mother, April 1968, when the city of Washington, D.C. was burning on the heels of Dr. King's assassination. My mom and another white Jewish man who's now a rabbi, who's 87, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, they organized 100 white people. They sent physicians into the streets to pick up Black bodies who had been shot and beaten by police. And they discovered chronic illness because, well, health inequities. They sent attorneys into the jail to demand a lowering of bail. 8,000 people had been arrested, thousands of them Black, for breaking a 4 p.m. curfew. White mothers and white nurses took in Black babies and Black children who had been lost in the fray. And right in front of you on the screen, they made this statement. They said, for 300 years, America has demanded that Blacks be nonviolent, even if whites are violent. Now it is time for white America to repay that historic debt. So one of the things as leaders, as white leaders, as non-Black leaders, thinking a bit about what humility looks like right now in the face of the racial injustice and the rage and resistance and pain that your Black employees, your Black colleagues, your Black friends, perhaps even your Black family members are experiencing in this moment, taking a step back and thinking about the idea that leadership might sometimes mean standing in silent solidarity and again, interrogating your own complicity in the silence that's also brought us to this moment.
There are 3 things I'm hoping we have time to get to, Chevara.
Sure.
One thing is, you said to me, and this has been in my head now since we spoke, it's not enough right now to be just a good person, to be someone who feels like they do not discriminate. I feel like I try to be a good person. I despise discrimination on every level, with every core of my being. But that's just not enough. We have to go past that. And I felt like I was doing the right thing. You say there's so much more.
Yeah, you know, I mentioned earlier Dr. Ibram Kendi. I'm a reader. I've got books all over my place. So this is how to be an anti-racist. And what Dr. Kendi talks about is it's not enough to say I'm non-racist. I mean, what I hear often in corporate spaces when I'm working with nonprofit executives, I hear the language of, but I'm a good person. I don't use the N-word. I have Black friends. Chevara, you're my Black friend, right? I'm everyone's Black friend. I'm going to start charging for that. There's like a real Black tax associated with that. If you need a Black perspective, I'm going to give you my Venmo, right? But on a serious note, this idea that if you are going to move the needle, if we are going to disrupt the system as a pyramid, right? The structure of racism, then white people would be doing what my mother did. Was it uncomfortable? Yes. My mother was a 24-year-old white woman who 2 years earlier had graduated from the University of Michigan, right? Were they afraid? Absolutely. Did they use their white privilege to create access, opportunity, and keep Black people safe? Absolutely. Were they informed by Black people's experiences? They weren't taking the reign. They also recognized that they weren't there to lead. They were there to stand in solidarity, right? And so being anti-racist means that every single day you are doing something to dismantle the system. I'll give you a good example. I shared this with Raylan the other day. 2 Fridays ago, I gave a fireside chat with 800 employees at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, many of them leaders. A few days later, I received a message on LinkedIn from one of the leaders, a senior vice president, and he reached out to actually ask me if the book I referenced, White Rage, was an appropriate read to begin a dialogue about race with his 2 sons, one 17 and one 20, who's a student at the University of Mississippi. Now, actually, it's too heavy a lift if that's the first conversation you're ever having in your life with your white sons, and I didn't want him to find himself swirling down a rabbit hole, so I said, let's talk. He asked me if it would be appropriate to have his son on the call because his oldest son was really grappling with Black Lives Matter. He was upset, he said, about the riots and the looting. I ended up having a 90-minute private coaching session with this leader and his 2 white sons. And one of the things that came out, just like I talked to you earlier about this narrative, how we need to pivot sometimes, the language we use, there is a real difference in the language of riot and rebellion. His son was upset. He said, why are they burning down their own buildings? What did my mother say? She said, persons don't intentionally burn down that which they own or find acceptable, only that which they can no longer tolerate. So that's the first thing. And two, there is a difference between the language of riot and rebellion. The language of riot is random act of violence. The language of rebellion is political response to historic oppression and structural inequity. And so I asked the young man, with those two definitions now, pivoting the narrative, what do you think is happening across our nation? And he said, it's obvious now, those are rebellions. But for a white leader, a corporate leader to say, I'm not going to just be bound by the structure I have at my office where I might have metrics of accountability. I am going to dismantle the system of white supremacy in my own home, recognizing that if I don't do this now, my white privileged sons are going to have the same white privileged walk down the hollowed white halls of corporate America and will have no sense of their privilege and their responsibility to disrupt systems of inequity.
Wow, that stuck with me. After that session, when a corporate executive brought his two sons in and sat them down for a conversation, they're college age. And what you said is true. If that's their first conversation, but you start there, right? Yeah. We have to start somewhere, and that's where they started. So you also mentioned, I want to talk a little bit about white and woke. Is this an appropriate time to share your work with white and woke?
Sure. So White and Woke is a national initiative that I actually created while I was living in Jacksonville, Florida. It came on the heels of me creating We Are Straight Allies, which I created in 2013 to help move forward a stalled and failed human rights ordinance in Jacksonville, Florida. I bring that up because the two are interrelated. So I created a We Are Straight Allies campaign that was intersectional. I had rabbis and Black pastors and corporate leaders. Gloria Steinem is in the campaign. Andrew Gillum is in the campaign, who ran for governor of our state. And we were successful in passing that policy 12-6 in 2017 because of its success and the national work that I was doing with the Human Rights Campaign and the Gill Foundation. I started wondering, what would it be like to create a similar movement, a similar initiative for white people who wanted to dismantle structural racism and needed a support system? What I was thinking about was the work in the 1960s of Black leaders like Stokely Carmichael, who came to be known as Kwame Ture, a Pan-Africanist. In 1966, he was at the University of Berkeley, and he was talking to students, and he said, listen, white students, don't join the NAACP or SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SCLC. I'd like you to organize with yourselves. White people do the work in your own communities, similar to how the white executive is doing that work in his own home. So I created White and Woke for white people who are interested in social justice work specific to race and racism, to dismantle and do the work and educate other white people. So that's the campaign. There's a website, whiteandwoke.org, but it's really a space for white people to do the work. So when you were asking me before, what are some things that we can be doing in our nonprofit spaces? That's one thing that leaders can be doing. And again, it helps to alleviate the emotional burden from your employees, your staff, your colleagues of color when you're doing the heavy lifting yourself.
Good. And Robert, I know that we have approximately 2 minutes left, so I'm going to do a quick summary. Some of the things, Chevara, you've said, things that we can do: invite white leaders to explore humility as a response, ask your organization to more deeply interrogate your systems, take a hard look through a different lens. People who want to be allies, use your privilege and your power to assist, and look at, is your rhetoric fitting the times? It's really important to look at that. And are you complicit in silence? That was really powerful to me. I have people that have said things that I don't agree with, and I kept my mouth shut. Now I feel like speaking up is the answer. I didn't want to spark a controversy. I wanted to keep the peace. That's the wrong answer. And Chevara, thank you for helping me see that.
No, you know, it's interesting. I do want to say one thing on that. You know, Dr. King had a really powerful quote. He said, we will have to repent in this world or the next, not only for the vitriolic words of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people, right? The appalling silence of the good people.
That is a very powerful place to end. And Robert, we will turn it back over to you. I think that because this was such an interactive chat, we had items flowing throughout the entire conversation. So Robert, back to you at 10:29 because we respect everyone's time.
Well, I was so busy because I'm writing notes, I'm looking up information. Chevara, you are just a wealth of knowledge. You present it in such a way that someone like stupid like me, I'm taking copious notes. I have lots of books for reading, and again, today was a special platform, and we've not done it this way before, and I'm so grateful to have you shared the experience with you and to learn from you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you all for being here today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everyone. We will be doing a virtual nonprofit council meeting in August. More details to come on that. But again, Raylan, thank you for making today happen. Chevara, thank you for sharing your precious time and talent with us. And I hope it sparks a lot of questions for everyone.
Thank you. And I know we didn't have a chance to get to questions. So if you want to find me on LinkedIn, if you have some questions, some thoughts, some ideas, please reach out to me. I'm accessible.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Everyone be well.
Thank you. Have a great day, folks. Thank you.